Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
The following incident happened in the winter of 2004. I was living in Reston, Washington at that time and was driving home from work at night. I turned off the Valley Freeway and started up Petrovitsky Road, passing Valley General Hospital at around 11:30 p.m. I approached the crest of a small hill, looked ahead and saw an object in the air. It was a horizontal ring of red and blue lights, flashing from left to right in some type of sequence. It was about 75 to 100 feet in diameter and hovered above a grove of trees at the southeast corner of the intersection. I slowed down and drove on for about 30 seconds at the same time looking at the lights. When I reached the intersection, I turned left, which put the UFO behind me. I continued to drive a short way and turned left into the parking lot of my apartment building. I parked her car and looked toward the object. It was gone, but I then looked to the left and saw another UFO. It was a cluster of red and blue lights, about 25 feet in diameter. It hovered about 100 to 150 feet off the ground, across the street about 200 feet from the car. I thought, if it moves or drops, I'm getting out of here. Then it began to move, dropping in a falling leaf motion back and forth to an altitude of about 20 to 50 feet. It stopped and started coming toward me. Terribly frightened, I got out of the car and rushed to my front door. I noticed my headlights were still on, so I ran back to the car, closed the door and turned off the lights. After that, I only remember that after turning off the headlights, I left the car and ran for the front door about 75 feet away. When I reached it, the UFO was gone. This incident left a deep and disturbing impression on me for over a year until I decided to seek professional help. I underwent a series of regressive hypnosis sessions in which I revealed that as I sat in the car, it suddenly was filled with a bright white light. The next thing I knew, I was standing in a dome-like room, about 15 feet wide, with white, very smooth floors, walls, and ceilings. An arched doorway was in front of me, as well as a desk-sized white box with a huge number of colored lights on a dark field. A long white table perched on a single pedestal was also behind me. I stood there calm, but kind of bewildered, and absently reached to unbutton the collar of my dress. The next thing I knew, the garment was at my feet. Two beings came through the door. They were about 4.5 to 5 feet tall with thin upper bodies, long, sloping shoulders. They seemed unable to straighten their arms completely. They had 4 rather short fingers and their heads were large and long. They had round eyes and their noses were very thin. Overall, their faces looked human, though they had no hair. They were dressed from neck to toe in blue and purple metallic fabric with high, thick collars. On the upper left chest of their uniforms there was a small insignia, a triangle inside a white circle that seemed to glow. They grasped me by the upper arms and guided me to the table. I wasn't frightened as the aliens gently pushed me down on the table. I sensed a third person in the room. He was like the other two, but wore a red-orange uniform with a black stripe around the neckline. He put a long silver object to my eyes and then placed the other end on my abdomen. He then moved it around a bit, removed it, and then left. He came back a short time later and the 3 beings stood around the table. What is the purpose of this? I thought. You are progressing physically and mentally as planned and are very receptive to us, they responded by telepathy, because I don't remember hearing voices. They added that they were pleased with my training. It was time for me to leave. I didn't want to go, but they assisted me off the table. I put my dress on, then they said, "You will see us again," and the next thing I knew I was back in my car. In October 2007, I was diagnosed with stomach cancer, which had spread into my liver. I was given only a few months to survive. I wondered if maybe these beings were actually angels who had warned me that I would see them after I passed away. The day before Thanksgiving, I was feeling very ill and decided to stay in bed. I knew I didn't have much time left to live and the pain was getting unbearable. As well, I hadn't been able to sleep for days. I darkened the room with heavy window shades, hoping that I could relax enough to sleep. I lay on the bed looking at the ceiling of my bedroom, staring at a small spot of light that had seeped through the curtains. I continued to look at the light when suddenly the entire room started to glow with a very bright white light, as well as a low humming sound. I tried to sit up but was unable to move, though I still felt the constant pain in my abdomen. I closed my eyes thinking I was dreaming. After a few seconds the sound stopped, so I opened my eyes. The room was again dark, but then I heard that familiar voice in my mind. "We have come back as promised, have hope. Rise so you may train your own kind." I got out of bed and had no pain whatsoever. In fact, I really felt wonderful and enjoyed my Thanksgiving holiday. A few days later, I was in the hospital for a scheduled CT scan. I was feeling remarkably well and told my physician that I had no pain for several days. After a few hours of waiting for the results, I was starting to worry because it never took this long to get results previously. After a while, I was called into the physician's office for consultation. He seemed perplexed. "You are in remission and it actually looks like the tumors are decreasing in size." This was totally unexpected. To make a long story short, I have been in remission since that time and the tumors are no longer there. There was one tumor that needed to be removed surgically, but the others simply vanished. I am sure it was the result of that visit. But I still wonder what training I received and who I will be training. It's obvious that my life was saved for a specific purpose.
One early morning in the winter of 1990, I awoke from a very deep sleep, feeling nervous as my heart pounded heavily. It was 3:35 a.m. and it was still dark outside. I sensed that there was someone in my bedroom, but all I could see was a spot of light in the corner by the dresser. Suddenly, several hands grabbed me from all around the bed. I attempted to scream but could not move or say anything. Nothing came out of my mouth. Within seconds, I found myself lying on a cold, hard table, completely nude and terribly uncomfortable. I looked around me and there were 4 small beings in hoods and loose robes standing around me. They were conversing with each other, but I could not understand what they were saying since it sounded like a young child's gibberish. I felt something touching me all over my body but could see nothing. The beings' faces had a weird glow with sagging folds of shining skin. After what seemed like forever, these beings slowly moved aside and this human-like man walked up to my side. He was tall, bald, and had very pale skin. He also had large round eyes and was very slim. He came over to the table and started to talk to me in English. He calmly said that he was perplexed that I was so scared since he made it clear the last time that they had met he would return to ask a favor. He then turned and raised his hand, gesturing to a woman who walked into the room. She seemed to be a normal human female and quite beautiful. She had a small bundle in her arms and walked over to me. It was an infant, but it had pale skin and didn't look quite human. The tall man instructed me that he wanted me to take the infant and care for it. It needed the love of a human mother since their race did not understand the emotion of love. I told him that I couldn't because I already had a child and it was hard enough raising my son alone since times were difficult for me currently. He raised his head up and down as if agreeing with what I said and passed his hands across my eyes. I must have passed out because I awoke and found myself in my bed. It was daylight and I figured that I had been gone for about 5 hours. When I tried to get out of bed, my legs and hips were very stiff and sore. I carefully stood up and noticed 2 large spots of wet blood on the bed sheets. The experience with the beings was still fresh in my mind, but I had no idea that I had endured any probing or surgery. A few days later, I decided to schedule a doctor's appointment just to make sure I was okay. The doctor recommended a full physical since my blood pressure was higher than usual, and my ankles were swollen. An appointment was made at my local hospital for x-rays and blood work. To make a long story short, I returned to my doctor's office a few days after the tests were performed. When I walked into her office, she asked me to sit down and explained that my right kidney was missing. She said that it was probably missing since birth and was just never noticed. I found this hard to believe since I had given birth to my child and have had other x-rays in the past. I just agreed with her assessment and was instructed that I would need to start taking hypertension medication and would need to be regularly monitored. I am positive that the beings removed my kidney and performed other experiments on my body. Though it has been almost 20 years since that encounter, I just know that they will be back.
It started a year ago on Halloween. I was out on the beach with my friends and we were having a grand old time having fun by the fire. Then suddenly, a flash of light. That's all anybody remembers. The events that followed, well, we have connected to that night. It's always the quiet ones, or so I'm told. Let's call her Jessica. Jessica was the token goth girl who was really into the paranormal and was also a realist. Days prior to the beach event, she claimed to be visited by otherworldly beings in her home at the family farm. She was a self-proclaimed witch. One of those. We believe she had something to do with all this. After the night at the beach, we all, including Jessica, woke up 2 towns over in the clearing of the dense woods. No car. No clothes. Just our underwear. Jessica and her boyfriend at the time were laid near each other hand in hand. I was the first to wake up. I rubbed my hand in my hair and I felt something I damned well knew wasn't there before. I had needle marks in my arm and it wasn't normal marks. Something happened that shouldn't have happened. Of course, I was angry and very distraught, so I began to run. It was while running I heard this muffled screech or growl. I really don't know what it was, but I had to cover my ears and close my eyes. It was in that whatever amount of lost time, I woke up in a hospital. My family has no history of mental illness or anything of the sort. I'm a healthy person and now this happens. The nurse tells me they found me on the side of the road naked and covered in handprints, bruises and lightning bolt-looking burn marks, that I had lost a lot of blood somehow. I was dehydrated and, for lack of a better word, taken advantage of. It has now been about a year since that event has taken place. I've stayed off the radar. Haven't spoken to anyone about any of this, not even my family. I haven't seen or spoken to my friends since that day I woke up in the woods, and now I'm losing time again and waking up every morning at 2:59 a.m. Things in my home are going missing and placed in odd places. My pets act differently now. My dog will growl for about 30 minutes every night at 5 a.m. at the window. I have a large bay window. I feel like I'm being monitored by something and it's not human. I've never believed in any of this stuff until it happened to me. None of this made it to the news and I don't really know exactly what happened to my friends either. I now reside alone and I'm trying to make sense of all of this. I don't want to completely pinpoint aliens, but I have a strong feeling whatever happened wasn't by the hands of a human. No human can make a noise like that or carry 5 people miles and miles away and perform those kinds of tests on them overnight.
My first experience happened when I was a child living in a small town in Texas in a house on a few acres of land for horses and cattle. My adoptive family brought me up with very strict upbringing. I wasn't allowed to watch very much television. Programming was very restricted and anything edgy was completely out of the question. So isolated from the outside world, I naively thought that people actually broke out in song and dance in the real world, like I'd seen in the many musicals we watched. Funny, huh? Cute? Maybe. But my point is that I'd never heard of nor seen anything about UFOs or aliens before in my life. Until one night, I found myself out in the field standing in front of a spaceship. I was in my nightgown and there was a being in front of me. Behind it stood the open hatch of a light-filled door. I do not remember how I got there or back inside. I have also forgotten what, if anything, was said or done to me at that time. When I spoke about it, I was reprimanded harshly and told I had an overactive imagination and it was only a dream. When I insisted on repeating my story, I was punished. I didn't understand why it upset them so much when I said I saw a UFO. I don't know if that is actually what I saw or what I related it to as far as my understanding of things at the time. They demanded to know where I'd seen such a thing, and the little television I was allowed to watch became much smaller to the point where to mention what had happened only brought negative consequences. So I stopped talking about it, subsequently its details gone, buried inside my mind like priceless treasure awaiting retrieval. Despite the fact, it remains forever in my memory. One night in early 2004, I was home alone at my apartment in Houston, Texas. As usual, I fell asleep on the couch in front of the television. Shortly after drifting off, I awoke feeling frightened, like I was in danger of some sort, and felt a strong urge to check and make sure the front door was locked. It was, so I laid back down and fell asleep once more. Suddenly, it seemed, I was again awake in my living room. However, I was now upright, gliding seamlessly across the floor. I looked down, realizing that I was not walking, but instead floating towards my bathroom. Upon this realization, I also recognized that I was not asleep and was consciously thinking to myself, I am floating. A series of emotions ran through me, confusion, fear, as well as excitement as to what was happening to me. But these feelings were tempered, and although I didn't understand why, I felt helpless to do anything to stop it. The bathroom was cold and dark, visibility possible due to the dim light coming from the plug-in by the sink. Although I have no memory of putting the toilet seat down, I found myself sitting on it confused. I thought to myself, what am I doing here? As I looked up, there in front of me was what is commonly known as a gray. It was standing slightly taller than me as I sat, staring at me stoically with its huge, unblinking eyes. Startled, my regretful reaction was to raise my hand up as if to hit it. My arm was instantly and simultaneously stopped and lowered in a series of short jerks. I immediately thought, it is controlling my body, and shortly thereafter realized that although I should have felt more afraid, I wasn't. I then thought to myself, it has subdued my emotions as well. It felt as if I had been drugged but was wide awake. I felt a little giddy about what was happening. As a matter of fact, I didn't mind at all and was eager to submit myself to the experience. This is when I found myself wishing I hadn't reacted in fear and raised my hand to it. But it was happening all so fast and I was not in the least bit in control of the situation. I did not verbally speak nor did it, but I remember thinking it knew exactly what I was thinking and proceeded with its agenda with astute purpose. I recall getting into the bathtub for some reason, but my memory after that is vague and muddled. I presume this is when it performed whatever experiment or procedure it came to do. When I awoke, the sun was starting to come up. I was oddly laying flat on my back with the covers tucked neatly, carefully under my arms. My chest was beaded with a wet necklace of huge round drops of sweat, my arms riddled with goosebumps. I instantly felt a rush of fear and excitement and also oddly a bit sad as well. My memories were indeed confirmed by the way I found myself. I am a notoriously bad sleeper and because of a painful back injury and never sleep prone. I had a real sense of missing time and felt a bit groggy. When I went to the bathroom, everything seemed in place outside of the fact that the shower curtain was not only pulled back completely, but wet as well. And of course the toilet seat was still down. There were spots of blood in my panties, and it hurt to urinate. Left only with this most vivid memory that I wanted to share, but found often that when I did it only brought odd silence and strange looks, assurances that it was only a dream. But it was not a dream. Throughout this experience I was consciously thinking. The details do not fade, and it has not been forgotten like any dream I've ever had. Not even when I showed what I feel is proof was I believed. In the big toe of my right foot I have an implant. There is no visible scar nor has it ever been painful. It seems right under the skin because its shape can be felt and the skin slightly raised, however it will not move. I am curious about the implant but do not want it removed. I believe that they are coming back for me to do some kind of doctor-like follow-up. I have been looking forward to it. This experience left me with no lasting effects, but feeling special, chosen, if you like, for some unknown purpose. Almost 10 years has passed when just last week, once again, they came to me while I was lying in bed watching television. That familiar feeling suddenly swept over me. I felt like I should check the door. Excited, I slowly got up trying to be completely aware and careful not to make, what I felt like, the same mistake of reacting with any kind of fear or non-compliance so that I might fully have this experience. I wanted to try to communicate and interact with it this time. I opened the door to the starless, midnight sky overhead. Looking out over the pond that usually held the shimmering reflection of the moon pictured in its surface, but tonight it lay empty, and still, dark and menacing. I closed the door and was swiftly overtaken and found myself immediately back in bed. I felt a surge of adrenaline as a green light enveloped me and suddenly had a strong sense of déjà vu. I was once again consciously thinking to myself that it was absolutely happening again. I had it in my mind as to how long ago the prior experience had taken place, but was quickly becoming overwhelmed. With the numbing effect of the light, its fluorescent color made me think to myself jokingly about being in the limelight, so to speak. This experience was a bit different. It all seemed to happen at once, quickly. Space and time were blurred in the limited confines of my travel trailer. All at once I was frozen, stuck in an odd, contorted fetal position. The room was so bright, lit with the huge picture of the television that took up almost the whole wall in front of the bed along with jade, radiating in an arc around me on the bed like some strange, stifling blanket. As it dissipated and shrank, I cautiously began to move, my neck stiff and slightly sore from the way my head had been turned. Even though it all seemed instantaneous, I knew a lot of time had passed because the program I had begun watching was not only over, but it was well into a show scheduled hours later. Sitting up, awestruck by it all, filled with wonder and hope, I just smiled. Left wondering when, if ever, they will come again and hoping they will. Soon.
In 1987, I experienced an event in which I later recalled while under hypnosis. After the regression session, I was able to remember some other details, including that I had missed about 3 hours during the incident. I was living in Arizona near the Santa Catalina Mountains. One afternoon, as I was sitting in a lounge chair on our back porch, I suddenly realized that I was being dragged into a craft by 2 small aliens. The next thing I remembered was waking up on a table inside the small craft. A guide greeted me and gave me something to drink. I believe that it was a stimulant of some kind because I was not sleepy after I drank the substance. In fact, the taste was quite pleasing. I was then taken out of the craft, looked around, and noticed I was standing on top of a hill. It was dark, but I noticed a light near a cavern. I walked up to this area, and it was then that I saw a man, dressed in a red military-type jumpsuit. My guide seemed to know this man as he greeted him. I also noticed that he wore some type of patch and was carrying an automatic weapon. When we walked into the tunnel, I realized they were going right into the side of a large hill or mountain. There we met with another guard in red, and I saw a computerized checkpoint with 2 cameras on each side. To my left was a large groove where a small transit vehicle carried people further inside. To my right, I saw a long hallway where there were many offices. We took the transit car and went for what seemed to be a very long time to another secure area. I was then told to step onto some type of device that looked like a scale and face the computer screen. I saw lights flashing and numbers computing, and then a card was issued with holes punched into it. It appeared to be an ID card. My guide did not speak much but did tell me that we had just entered level 1 of the facility. I was eventually transported to a lower level where I witnessed additional armed guards. I was then taken down another hall, and there I noticed a horrible putrid smell. I then saw huge tanks with computerized gauges hooked to them and a huge arm-like device that extended from the top of some tubing down into the tanks. In a large laboratory-like room, I noticed a small gray being with his back turned to me working on something at a computer. I was then told to sit on a table in the middle of the room. About this time, a human man dressed like a doctor entered the room. He wore a white lab coat with a badge. The temperature in the room seemed awfully cold. By this time, I was frustrated and began to cry and to tremble. Then suddenly I felt a stabbing pain. I screamed, and the human doctor stood next to me and rubbed something over my stomach. The pain immediately subsided. Soon I became drowsy and was returned to the porch. When I awoke, I was laying on the porch floor by the door. For several months after that day, I knew something had happened, but I was unable to comprehend what it was. That is why I sought medical help. I have not had any other encounters, but believe that I will in the future, though I was never told this.
This story involves an unidentifiable metal implant found in the cheek of a family member. This was found by Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas by X-ray and MRI. This thing, whatever it is, was not something that we were ever previously told about, nor was it anything associated with why he was receiving care at Parkland. They noted it several times and did not make any conclusions. Parkland made no mention of this thing to us or him. I discovered the reports of the implanted object after getting his medical files from Parkland from a private physician. The reports simply state there is a metallic foreign body present in the right cheek. Oddly, the VIA hospital in Dallas made no note whatsoever of the object in their MRI or X-ray reports, yet there are numerous reports in the Parkland files. There is no wound accompanying the metal object. Our relatives couldn't feel it and did not know it was there. This was discovered in May 2010 after he fell at home and the EMTs took him to Parkland where extensive testing was done, and then approximately 4 days later he was transferred by ambulance to the VIA hospital in Dallas. He is retired, and over the years I have wondered many times if the military implanted something in his body. He never was in battle or explosions, but his job in the military was classified. I do know families of military guys who have said civilian hospitals found strange metal implants in such places as the mastoid area of their loved ones. We really don't know what to think about this or the UFO issues. We just want to know what this thing is and if anyone out there has any information on these implants. At this time, we have no idea if it should be included in any surgical removal plan or not. He is old and physically frail now, but his mind is clear as a bell, and of course we are wondering if that thing showed up in the films years ago and nobody said anything. I'd like to pull all those records. All of the other metallic items noted on the films, such as clamps and wires from heart surgery, were correctly and readily identified. Not that thing in his cheek.
On Saturday, November 3rd, 2007 at approximately 8:30 p.m. my life ended. Not literally, but everything I had gained and achieved to that point was taken away from me. Since that day I can only recall bits and pieces of my past, but barely enough to independently get by. Fortunately for me, my mom and dad have persevered with me though. Without them, I'm not sure if I'd be able to survive on my own. I will attempt to describe what happened to me even though much of my personal history before that day has been provided by my parents and other acquaintances. The remaining information comes by way of my therapist, who has extracted and recorded it from the deep recesses of my mind by means of several regressive hypnotherapy sessions. Here we go. During the evening of that fateful day, I had spent most of the afternoon attending campus events at Georgia Tech, where I was in my 4th year. I was accompanied by a few friends who, like myself, were biomedical engineering majors. I was looking forward to continuing my graduate studies at Duke University the following year. Around 8 p.m. we had just finished eating dinner at a local restaurant and decided to go to a friend's dorm room and watch TV. This is where things get fuzzy. I was told, by friends and others, that we were walking on McMillan Street, about a block from the friend's residence hall, when I told the group that I needed to see someone and that I would catch up with them later. The first thing I remember after that point of time is that I was laid back in a large recliner-like chair, but I had no idea where I was. My eyes were open, but I couldn't see anything other than blurry bright white light. I also felt paralyzed and could not speak. There was no sound other than a low droning that seemed to vibrate all around me. I have no idea how long I was there, but I would wake for a few minutes then doze off again. For some reason I sensed that I had been in the recliner for a very long time. At some point I woke to a series of chirping sounds as well as the sense of something moving around me. I also noticed that I had no sense of smell, though I could still breathe through my nose. Again I would continue to doze off and on. My perception of time was non-existent. When I would wake I felt like I just wanted to die because I feared that I would be in this state for the remainder of my life. Anxiety and frustration overwhelmed me, but I couldn't move or yell for help. This was all I could consciously remember about the incident. I was found 45 hours later wandering aimlessly in one of the terminals at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, which is on the other side of Atlanta. I had been reported missing by my friends, and my parents had already driven from our home in Raleigh, North Carolina. The police took me to a nearby hospital where I was kept for several days. I don't remember my hospital stay. My parents drove me home to Raleigh after I was released from the hospital. This is where I have remained since. During the past 4 years I have attempted to regain what I had forgotten, but I am not progressing very well. I remembered my parents, my sisters and other relatives and a few flashbacks from college, but little else can be recalled. I have undergone many neurological tests and have been prescribed a few medications, but I still am unable to remember my past. In fact, I have experienced a few bouts of deep depression and am afraid to venture far from home unless someone is with me. I have a tremendous hypnotherapist who has used regression therapy to help me express my feelings during my abduction. Yes, that is what my hypnotherapist believes happened to me. I will attempt to describe what my regression sessions produced. At some period during the abduction I must have been able to see my captors because I provided a fairly detailed description while under hypnosis. These things were about 5 feet tall and had bodies similar to humans. They wore yellow and crimson overalls made of a very thin material. The heads were shaped like humans, but each had pointed chins, small noses and ears, as well as a narrow mouth with dark thin lips. The eyes were larger than human eyes and circular with dark pupils, but you could tell when they focused on you because the pupils would narrow and the eye would expand in size. I never heard them speak, but they would emit an odd chirping. They had bald heads and no noticeable hair. The skin was translucent with a yellow-green tint. The hands had 5 fingers with nails, but the thumbs were short compared to humans. I don't remember any procedures being performed on me, but I do recall writing answers to questions on a device, though I don't know how I was given the questions, if that makes any sense. Some of the questions were physics equations and others were related to human physiology. Beyond that, I couldn't recall anything more. I truly believe we are being observed by another species. I don't know if they are aliens or if they have been on this planet longer than us, but I think that we should be concerned. I have tried to avoid feeling sorry for myself, but I cannot stop thinking that I will most likely suffer permanent effects as a result of my abduction. Regardless, I can say that I still possess some hope that I will one day snap out of this ordeal and move on with my life.
I'm not sure where to begin, but I feel I need to relay this story in a public place in case something happens to me. I have left information as a precaution that my brother may find if I were to go missing. Honestly, I am really perplexed by this whole thing as I consider myself a big skeptic of things like this, and I tried to write off this meeting I had with this very strange person about 12 years ago. Because of something else that has happened a couple of days ago which I believe to be related to this guy, I feel the need to revisit the possibility of this being more than just an oddity. To put into perspective why I believe this man to be related to what just happened to me recently, I need to explain a bit about my background and the first time I believe I encountered things associated with this guy. I am Southern and almost 30 now. The incident related to this man who I call the rancher happened when I was 18 working my first real job. It was the fall of 2007 when I met this guy, but I believe I may have come into contact with these things which I now heavily associate with him when I was 10 years old. I lived in Tennessee for the first part of my childhood. There is a very small town outside of Knoxville a couple of hours where my grandfather had a farm. We'd visit semi-regularly and I would get to go and see the cows and chickens he raised. We would pay him for meat sometimes when he was going to slaughter one of the cows and freeze it for meals for months. They also had corn and other crops there that he would harvest. His main source of income though was a retirement from the military, and he had several sheds and workshops where he would fix discarded appliances and vehicles and sell them. The first incident in question was during the summer of 1998 on his farm. I was actually out playing with one of their border collies while my granddad was out in the field feeding the cattle. The farm is in the hills as this area is part of the Smoky Mountains, and the farm was quite large. I don't know how large off the top of my head, but large enough that it had big fields, a smaller area for crops, and his property encompassed a very large portion of the surrounding wooded areas. Me and the dog, who was named Sweetie, wandered up into the wooded area a bit during the time he was feeding the cattle. I was alone except for Sweetie when this occurred, and I was so young at the time that the memory was and still is to some extent a bit fuzzy. But the important part is still very clear. During this particular excursion into those woods, me and Sweetie came across what I can only describe as a large tree with a hole beneath it. As we came up on this hole, I looked down into it and I couldn't see the bottom, and it was pitch black. For the longest time I thought that this was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but I believe what I saw then was real now. My head started almost buzzing and I felt my hair stand on end. I started shaking, but I couldn't look away from it. I felt like if I started to run I would die. It's really hard to describe the sensation, but I would call it an impending sense of dread. There were eyes looking back at me from this hole, but I couldn't see the body at first. Then I saw what looked like a smile and a very small body of this humanoid-looking thing. Its body was entirely black, like freshly laid asphalt. It was unnaturally black. I mean, it was like looking into the absence of light. The only light portions were the eyes and eventually the mouth. It kind of smiled at me. And I felt like I was going to die looking at it, but I couldn't run away. After that it's like I can't remember exactly what happened, and my next memory is me walking back for dinner. I should also tell you that we could not find Sweetie after that. I felt so bad because I really loved that dog. I didn't tell anyone what I saw because I didn't want them to think I was crazy. And over time this memory kind of faded, and I ended up thinking I either dreamed this or I was simply remembering wrong. Fast forward to 2007. I was almost 19 and it was the fall of that year. I was working at my first real job while attending college for computer science. Keep in mind, by this time, I did not believe in anything supernatural, extraterrestrial, or anything remotely paranormal. My job was at a bookstore. It is a chain of bookstores which I think are mostly regional to the south. At this point, we had moved to Alabama and had been living in that state for almost 9 years. I had actually just gotten a promotion to work at the store's joint coffee shop as a barista, but I also still sometimes worked the register or did stocking. The first time I encountered this man that I refer to as the rancher, I was actually working the front cash register. I often worked the late shift there, which was from 4 to 12. We would start closing around 11:30 though, and I did most of that by myself as it was usually just me and one of the assistant managers and a barista for the coffee shop there that late. It was around 11 p.m., and this guy came in, and I immediately got this strange feeling about this guy. The reason I call this guy the rancher is that he was dressed like a cowboy straight out of a Western film or even a rodeo. I had family in Texas, so I had been to rodeos before, and I mean, this guy was just very strange. To be walking into a bookstore at 11 p.m. decked out in snakeskin cowboy boots, a cowboy hat and Western-looking clothes. I thought at first he was just a tourist or something and went back to reading. I read books in the evenings because we didn't get a lot of people buying books that late. We mostly stayed open because there were lots of groups that liked our coffee shop, and I guess they made money off it being open in the evenings. This guy walked to the back at some point for about a good 20 minutes. Then when I was about to make a closing announcement like I usually do at 11:30, he came up to the counter with 4 books. I thought the selection was a very strange mix of material. One of them was a physics book, one was an automotives manual, one was something on New Age religion, and the other was about martial arts. I honestly don't remember the specific titles because what really stuck out about that event was the guy. I could barely look away from him while I was helping him check out. I started getting this feeling that something about this guy's body was like fake. His skin was extremely pale, not out of the realm of possibility, but very unusual. He was the whitest man I've ever seen without being an obvious albino or something. The other thing was his eyes. They were beady, like they almost looked like glass eyeballs, like maybe he was wearing contacts, but it was really hard to tell exactly why they looked that way. He smiled at me as well the entire time, and it was more than just a friendly grin, it almost felt like a sexual flirtation or something. At the end, when I had finished ringing him up and bagging his books, I realized he hadn't said anything to me, and I had been making my usual niceties I like to think of as customer service. But at the end, he stopped for a minute and stared at me before leaving, and asked, "What did you say your name was?" I thought this was really bizarre at the time, because number 1, I had a name tag on, and number 2, I had never told him my name during the conversation at all. But for some reason he acted like I did and he had just forgotten. I told him my name and he said, "Oh, what a nice name that is. I'll have to ask for you if I return here." At this point I just thought this guy was hitting on me or something. He was really creepy, and I just wanted him to leave as soon as possible. Thankfully he did leave. Unfortunately, I would see him one more time about 3 weeks later. It was late again, a little after 10 p.m., and this time I was actually working in the coffee shop. I was making coffee drinks for a group of students that came in to do a study group or club or something there pretty often, and when I turned around to start giving them their order, I realized the rancher guy was back there behind them. He was in the same cowboy-like attire, and he was standing very still and just looking up in my direction with that same weird smile. It almost seemed forced. I felt this weird sense of dread, and I was reminded of the memory from my childhood because it was the only other time I had ever had that type of sensation before. The students left and he came up and ordered, and he said he wanted a bottle of milk from our mini fridge. I got it for him and he paid. I watched as he stood there, opened it and started drinking it, then he paused and said, "It's good, but missing something." He drank half the bottle and I watched him go over to our cafe area where we had creamer sitting out for people's coffee. He proceeded to pour creamer into the bottle until it was nearly full again, then resumed drinking, and he drank the entire thing, in one continuous gulp without breathing. He left to go into the store where the book racks are. I was hoping he had left by the time I took my evening break not long after, and I made myself a drink, and went to sit at one of the tables on our adjoined patio area. This was at 11 p.m., because I always took my evening break then when I worked in the coffee shop. I was sitting there reading my book and trying to enjoy my drink after that unnerving experience, and then I heard our patio door open and it was the rancher guy again. I realized I was cornered, and he sat down at my table directly across from me. He sat motionless, but had that weird smile still, and he took off his hat and put it on the table. That is when I realized this guy was also bald, and his scalp looked very strange, like it had never had hair at all. It almost looked like rubber. It was very odd. I asked if I could help him find something, thinking maybe he was just being creepy and trying to hit on me again or something. He said my name rather calmly, and then the conversation got very strange and specific. He said, "I am actually here because you are one of my tasked individuals. I don't really know why you're on my list for this area, but you are. And I like you, so I'm going to be frank with you. I am not entirely human." He paused at this point. And I had that feeling of dread again, even more than before, and I was like crawling out of my skin at this point. I actually panicked and got up, and as I did he said my address and I froze and realized this guy knew where I lived and who I was or something. He said, "Sit down, you're making this difficult." Then he told me, "I'm not going to hurt you, that's not my job. My job is to simply keep track of individuals I've been tasked with, that is all. And I need to ask you a few questions to make sure there are not going to be any problems." He started smiling again and it was like a forced smile, it looked fake and he looked so strange. But I sat down because this guy had threatened me at my home and I didn't know what else to do other than see what he wanted with me, and maybe get more info on the guy so I could call the police after he left. He said, "I'm actually from a certain organization that manages many things here on this planet, and I am what you would call a liaison between your kind and them. I am partially them, but mostly one of you, and so I am tasked with direct prolonged communications with your type." He proceeded to ask me some questions about whether or not I had ever seen anything out of the ordinary, and who I might have told about it. Obviously he meant something other than him, because I remarked he's freaking me out and asked if this was some kind of prank. I finally told him about my memory from when I was a kid and told him that I hadn't told anyone about it at all. He remarked that would likely be the reason I was on his list. He also asked me a few other seemingly unrelated questions. He asked me what I was studying in school and where I thought I might work after I graduated. He seemed interested in considering military contractor work, and also asked about some of my family members' military service. In between each question he paused for like a good 20 or 30 seconds. I asked him what he was doing after the third time this happened, and he said he was scanning my possible timelines for confirmation. He told me his kind could actually see different spectrums than us, and that he was having this conversation with multiple versions of myself. He was making sure none of them were going to become problematic for him because he hated having to return. After several questions he gave that smile and said, "All done." He got up and said, people weren't likely to believe me, but that I should not talk about the small black creatures I encountered, or I could meet with someone else from his organization with a different designation and it may not end as nicely for me. After this I didn't see the rancher guy again, and I tried to forget the event as best I could. I actually went to therapy for this, though I didn't give the therapist specific details about this encounter. She helped me greatly and I was able to finish school. I work as a software engineer now, and I've not had any strange occurrences for 12 years. This year I adopted a dachshund puppy. He's very sweet. He's about 7 months old now and we like to play outside in the afternoons. A couple of days ago, I was on my porch relaxing when I heard him growling. I have never heard him growl before at anything. He's barked before, but never growled. I rushed over to see what was wrong because I thought maybe he found a wild animal or something. He was growling at the gap beneath my wooden deck. I looked under there, moving him to the side, and I saw a small dark figure and eyes. I grabbed my pup and ran back upstairs and inside and locked all of the doors. I am very upset and anxious over this and have been losing a lot of sleep. I had an exterminator come out and he said he couldn't find anything even after I begged him to look the whole area over twice, and told him I thought maybe mice or something were under my deck. He found nothing. That is why I am posting this story anonymously but also in a public forum so there is record. I am extremely afraid that I might be visited by that bizarre man or someone associated with him, and if for some reason I go missing I have set an automated delivery message to go to my brother if I am absent for more than a month. Godspeed. I hope none of you have ever encountered this guy or any of his people.
During the pandemic, my husband and I would go for rides around Mount Davis, Pennsylvania in southern Somerset County, approximately 5 miles north of the Maryland line. It is the highest point in Pennsylvania. Neither of us was working. It was during the lockdown. No one was to be out. The date was June 22, 2020. We would ride around looking for deer, wildlife, etc. Nothing else to do. There is also state game land. We would very rarely see another vehicle. That night the deer were bedded down along the side of the road. They were acting unusually. We were on the main road coming up the mountain from High Point Lake. A deer ran out in front of us, stopped, turned around, and ran in the direction it came from, which was from the right. As we sat there for a moment, we were watching to make sure that more deer didn't run out. There was an opening in the brush and trees on the left. Something caught both of our eyes. Neither of us said a word. My husband had a flashlight and was holding it out the window. It was after 11 p.m., so it is illegal to use a spotlight at that time in Pennsylvania. I was in shock and could not believe what I was seeing. In the opening right along the side of the road stood a humanoid alien. It turned as if in slow motion, bending its knees to turn, lifted its arm to reach for a limb, and just stood there staring at us and us at it. I had my phone on my lap. I wanted to take a picture, but I had so many thoughts running through my mind. I thought, what if I take a picture and it pisses it off? Needless to say, I didn't. We just sat there looking at it in disbelief, and it was standing there looking at us. I told my husband to just go. So he pulled away. Once we got up the road a little way, I asked him, what type of species would you say that was? He replied that he would say that was an alien because that is exactly what they look like in the movies. A gray humanoid type. So, in my opinion, I think there was more going on during the COVID lockdown than we were told.
I was in my backyard, and my dog was barking like crazy. I was trying to get her to be quiet. She kept running back and forth in the yard, jumping up the fence, as if chasing a cat. She was barking, and she then sat in the middle of the yard. I finally got up one last time to bring her inside, but as soon as I got next to her, she stopped barking. It was so silent. At night, you can see the stars, but, for the most part, there weren't any. It was pitch black. I mean, nothing. Then, the stars were in the shape of an ellipse, but I don't know for sure. My phone broke, like, literally broke. The battery was dripping. I don't know what happened next. I woke up in my room and I haven't talked to anyone except for one person. The second encounter I had, which I've sent before, was in my living room. In the morning, but the sun was barely rising. It was around 4 or 5 a.m. in the summer. I looked out the window, and there it was. Clear as day. A being. Its face was bony, very skinny, sucked into the bone. It had no eyes. No nose. It had holes on the sides of its head, which I thought were like a reptile's ears. But it was fleshy. It looked human. But it had the slightest pale green in it, blue in some spots. It was tall, but hunched over, with 4 arms and very small legs. It had a very large spine, like, it was long, and it was very prominent. Also very easy to see through its flesh. It had something else, where our ribs would be. It looked like gills. They were bright pink. No tail. I dropped my glass of milk and it turned to look at me. It stared, for what felt like hours. I know exactly what it looks like. I could almost feel the creature through the glass. I blacked out. I woke up later around 12 noon. Then lastly, the reason why I reported all this to you. I was in Page, Arizona with a friend who is Navajo. He took me to meet his family on the reservation. That first night, we went out at about midnight. We walked up on top of this huge sandstone ridge, and his father told us never to leave at night. I didn't listen. Mind you, I'm a very intelligent 14-year-old boy. I should have listened. There was a bright light. Illuminated the valley. It was as bright as day. It grew brighter and brighter. And then it kind of conned into a small area, like a stage light, but really bright. We could feel the heat. The cone of light grew so small you could barely see it, yet it grew hotter and hotter. It was like a laser. Then a loud buzzing sound started. It was a low hum, then a loud ring. Then complete silence, but it was bright. The light sketched across the sand like lighting or a crack in the ice. We ran faster than I've run before. We later decided to walk back to the sands the next night. We walked out there, and it was overcast and raining, but the rain was caught and wouldn't sink into the sand. We dug in. For a radius of 30 feet, there was glass. It looked like a spider web on the top, with a plate under it. We later dug it up and it looked random to me. But who knows? His father said to leave it. It's not for the media, so we buried it. Shortly after, the man's cattle and sheep started to disappear.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.